So good morning to you all, and thank you for your interest in this roundtable, which is one of the roundtables that I usually organize on a yearly basis within the employment policies and labor market course that is offered in the political science and philosophy, politics and economy bachelor degrees of this university. These roundtables are meant to address topics that are thought to be of broad interest, that is an interest for the community, both here, beyond the limits of the course, and also issues that are of political interest, not only of academic interest, but of political interest. So the Spanish labor market, as some of you will know, suffer from chronic and outstanding rates of temporary employment that are well known to be negative at an individual level and at the national level. At an individual level, because it means usually a lower return of the human capital investment, and at the national level because it compromises the productivity and the competitiveness of the economy. And these outstanding rates have been here in the Spanish labor market from the 80s onwards, and there have been a number of labor market reforms, but they have barely succeeded in subsiding or reducing these labor market reforms. And now there has been a latest recent, labor market reform, and it seems to be associated with a decrease in temporary employment. So this triggered a number of questions that I thought that it was, again, of interest not only for the course, but for the broad academic community. And these questions are basically the following. First of all, to what extent do we know if there is a causal association, or we are able to establish a causal association between this labor market reform and the reduction in temporary employment that we are being informed by media, etc., etc. May there be any kind of a spurious relationship so that in time this reform has coincided with things that are also reducing temporary employment? So this was the first question. The second question is, could there be that any new legal type of contracts that have been established by the labor market reform are giving the idea that there's been a reduction in temporary employment and an increase in indefinite employment, but actually what there has been is a reduction in labor market activity because these new type of contracts are associated with a reduction of the labor market activity along the year. This is the second question. And the third question, if finally there's been a success, what are the reasons why this reform has succeeded with other previous ones did not? So these are questions that quite often I'm not able to answer, and as it had happened in many other previous roundtables that I have organized, I try to invite colleagues that are well-known experts on the topic and could enlighten us, my students and I. So this is the reason I invited, and we have the luxury to have here Libertad González and Miguel Ángel Malo. They are well-known experts in labor market issues and analysts of the Spanish labor market. Libertad González is got a PhD from Northwestern University in the United States. He's associate professor of our own university. He's ICREA Academia and holds an ICREA Academia and an ESR grant, ERC grant, which is the most prestigious research grants at the European level. She has made a sort of extensive research on areas. Her main areas of research are labor economics, demographic economics, gender labor market inequality, and public policy, and has published the results of this research in well-known top journals in these fields like Journal of Health Economics, the Journal of Human Resources, or the Journal of Public Economics, among others. So I think it's really a pleasure to have her with us, and I really appreciate that she has given part of her time to us. Miguel Ángel Malo is a well-known colleague who has been invited to these roundtables. She's professor of economics and at the Department of Economics and Economic History in the University of Salamanca, and has worked for the International Labour Organization, and her research interests are really closely associated to the topic of this roundtable. She has done research on non-standard employment, labor market policies and reforms, and employment of people with disabilities. And he has published this research in, among other well-known journals in these fields, in socioeconomic research, labor economics, aging and society, or social indicator research. So I think it's great that we are able to be enlightened or having these questions answered by our two colleagues. The thing will be like that. Libertad will present her answers to these questions, 20 minutes, then the word will be given to Miguel Ángel Malo, and then there will be the opportunity for you and for me to intervene. So thank you very much for your presence here. So Libertad, the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you very much, Luis. So good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to present in front of this selected audience. So yeah, thanks Luis for the invitation. My name is Libertad González, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Economics and Business here at Pompeu Fabra. I'm a labor economist, and okay, let me set my timer. Perfect. Okay, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how can we try to evaluate the effects of this Spanish labor market reform of 2022. And I'm going to try to make 2 points here. One point is going to be about what are the outcomes that we're interested in? If we want to try to understand whether this reform was successful, what do we mean by that? What is the kind of the goal of this reform, and what are the variables that we can look at in order to try to understand whether it achieved its goals or not, whether it had the effects that the policymakers intended or not. And the second point is we're interested in the causal effects of this reform on labor market outcomes. And so the question is, how can we try to get answers beyond just looking at, the time series of employment or the rates of temporary employment? How can we really link or isolate the causal effect of this reform from other things going on at the same time? And both of these, so the answers to both of these questions are not obvious. Okay, so I will tell you briefly about the main elements of this reform. Then I will talk about what are the expected effects of the reform and the intended effects of the reform. Then I will tell you about some ideas about how we can try to evaluate the causal effects of the reform. And then I will show you some preliminary results. Okay, so the main elements of the reform. It's a legal reform and it's complicated. There are a lot of details, so I'm just going to try to give you like the main elements of this reform. As Luis already mentioned, the starting point for this reform is the large incidence of temporary employment in Spain since the 1980s. Just to give you one number, there are different ways of measuring this, but looking at the 5 years before the reform, so from 2017 to 2021, if we look at, say, new hires, new contracts, the particular way that I'm measuring it, more than 80% of all new hires were hired with fixed-term contracts. So the vast majority of contracts that are signed every month in Spain used to be fixed-term contracts. Why so many fixed-term contracts? Well, the main reason is that they have lower firing costs compared with open-ended contracts, combined with the fact that a firm did not really used to need to justify the short-term nature of the job. So you could just, hire a worker for 3 months, and then the 3 months are over, the worker is fired, 0 firing costs, and it doesn't have to be necessarily, you don't need to provide any reason for the contract being 3 months. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem, the reason why I think it's a problem is because it creates this duality in the Spanish labor market because of the huge differences in firing costs between these very cheap short-term contracts and the open-ended contracts, which have much higher firing costs. So there are good jobs and bad jobs, and this creates this distortion, this inefficiency, which governments have been worried about for a long time. So in 2021, the government managed to pass a reform
that tried to limit the use of temporary contracts. The reform was the process of is the result of a long process, and it was agreed between government, unions, employer representatives. It was passed in late December 2021, and it was the full implementation started in April 2022. So the first quarter of 2022 was sort of that transition period. What was the main element in this reform? Again, a lot of details, but just to focus on the main element. Essentially, we go from a regime where you don't need to justify why you're hiring someone on a short-term basis to a new situation where open-ended contracts are the default. Now, if you want to hire someone, with a short-term contract, you need to justify this, and there are clear sanctions, clear fines if you hire someone with a short-term contract without any particular justification. So, okay, so this is the main element of the reform, and this is the first figure where I wanted to show you, just the number that I was mentioning earlier. So the fact that in the 5 years before the reform, most of the contracts that are signed in Spain are temporary contracts. So here I'm using, and I'm going to show you today, data from the Spanish Labor Force Survey, Encuesta de Población Activa, and I'm going to focus on sort of prime age workers, so workers between ages 25 and 55. And what I'm doing here is looking at workers. So this survey,
many households every quarter, and they ask people, are you currently working, and how long have you been in this job? So what I'm defining here as a new hire is workers who have been at their job for less than 3 months. So, these are workers who are starting their new job, and I'm showing here the share of all employed workers who, of all new hires, as I define them, who are on a temporary contract. So, more than 80% of these new hires
are temporary before the reform, and you can see that this trend is flat. So, this about 80%, a little bit higher than 80% was going on at least for these 5 years. Okay, so this was just summarizing kind of the main elements of the reform and a little bit of the context. Okay, what are the expected effects of the reform? So what we're trying to start to answer today is whether the reform was successful or not. So of course, something that we need to think about is what do we mean by successful? What were the goals of the reform and were they achieved or not? Of course, first of all, because it's a reform that essentially doesn't ban temporary contracts, but it makes it harder to use temporary contracts. First of all, we want to look at whether in fact the reform succeeded at reducing the use of temporary contracts. But it's not that we care about temporary contracts per se. What we care about is, quantity and quality of employment, right? So I think looking at the press or at some presentations about the reform, many people focus almost exclusively on the incidence of temporary versus permanent contracts. I think what we really care about is job quantity and quality. So overall employment levels and quality of those jobs. Did the reform affect total employment, the unemployment rate, job stability, wages, hours worked? In other words, if we see fewer temporary contracts and more permanent contracts, is this just a renaming, or do we really see, effects on job quality and quantity? So I think this is important. I'm going to try to say something about both of these in the talk. Okay, so this is my first point. What are the outcomes that we care about? And I think they should be total employment, or say employment to population ratio or unemployment rate, but also job quality, measured wages, job stability, and so on. And then the second point that I wanted to talk about was how can we try to think about the causal impacts of the reform? And here I think something that I want to highlight is that just studying the time series of the variables that we care about is not necessarily going to give us the answer that we want. And that's because, as you know, if you just look at how things move over time, there are many things going on at the same time. So, I'm going to show you numbers, data for 2017 to 2022, and there are a bunch of very important things going on during this period affecting employment. There's the cycle, of course, after 2013, we're in an expansion period where employment is growing and employment rate is falling. It's a period of recovery from the previous crisis. Then, of course, 2020 comes and the pandemic hits, so huge impacts on the labor market. And in 2022, we have issues related with inflation, with war. So there's a bunch of stuff going on, which is affecting economic conditions and potentially hiring and firing decisions of firms and so on. And it's very hard to separate. Okay, so let me show you, along some of the variables that we care about, just the time series, which I told you we shouldn't stop there, but let's start there. So, first of all, for the use of temporary contracts, the permanent versus temporary contracts, let me show you the evolution of the share of temporary workers among new hires after the reform. Okay, so the vertical red line
marks the first quarter of 2022. This is the sort of transition quarter. So this is after the reform is passed, before it's fully implemented. And what we see is that, it's not hard to see that immediately after the reform is passed, there is, this flat trend above 80% that we had for the 5 years prior to the reform changes, and now we go from, the numbers are from, say, 81% to 65%. So if we just compare, the pre-period with 2022 or the end of 2022, we see a 16% reduction in the share of temporary contracts among new hires. So, this is suggestive that at least in terms of the primary thing that the reform was doing, which was making it harder to hire workers with temporary contracts, is in fact seemed to have happened to some extent. Of course, the other side is, the share of permanent contracts. Here I'm sort of showing the flow, so new hires. Now here I'm showing the stock. So this is the share of permanent contracts among all workers in this region. And here what we see is again evidence of something changing, coinciding with the passing of the reform. Even though here when we look at the stock of the share of permanent contracts, we can see clearly a positive trend, right? So it was already, the share of permanent contracts was already increasing during this period, and even if you look back from before. So there is a pre-existing trend, but it does look like things change qualitatively in 2022. With this becomes steeper. So we go from 64% of ongoing contracts being permanent at the end of 2021 to 71% at the end of 2022. So again a significant 7-point increase in this case. This is again the stock. If we look at the share of permanent among new hires, you can see it even more clearly. This is similar to what I showed you before. So this descriptive evidence is suggestive of strong effects on the very dimension that the reform was targeting, which was increasing the share, increasing the use of permanent contracts or open-ended contracts. Okay. Now this is not necessarily what we care about per se. We care about, as I said, total employment and also quality of employment. So what happened with total employment over this period? So here I'm showing the employment to population ratio, so the number of people who are employed, ages 25 to 55, divided by the population in the States. And here, it's not so obvious to see just from the time series, right, whether the reform had any impact on employment. Well, again, we have a pre-existing trend, a positive trend. The employment to population ratio was increasing in 2017, 18, 19. Then, of course, we have COVID here, which complicates things. There's a drop in the second quarter of 2020. And then it sort of goes back to this increasing trend. And then what happens in 2022? Well, not much, but what do we compare it with? Like, it's not even so clear. Total employment doesn't fall in 2022. So maybe that's good news, but it wasn't an increasing trend. Now it's not, so it's really very hard to say anything about total employment just from the time trend. Okay, so then let me move to my last point, which is how can we try to say something about the causal impact of the reform? And the answer is that we need
more than just looking descriptively at the time series. We need an identification strategy. What do I mean by this? Well, we need somehow a control group. So we need to understand what would have happened with employment in the absence of the reform, in the same time period, but in the absence of the reform. This is, of course, not obvious. There's no obvious control group. And the reason is that the reform is national and it affects all firms. In some of the countries, when they pass labor market reform, sometimes there's a natural control group. For example, in Italy, one of these reforms targeting temporary employment only affected firms with more than 20 workers or 15 workers or 50. I don't remember the number. And then we have, like a natural control group is the type of firm which is unaffected by the reform, defined by firm size. In the case of Spain, all firms are affected. So how can we find a control group? One thing we can try to do, which is what I propose, is to look for firms that were somehow less exposed to the reform. What do we mean by less exposed? Well, the reform, because it restricts the use of temporary contracts, would affect more firms that rely more on temporary contracts. Perhaps there are some firms in some sectors, in some regions, in some occupations, perhaps there are some firms that just were not using temporary contracts at all for reasons, for reasons unrelated to the recent shocks. And then we can use those types of firms as a control group. Okay, so how do we find those control firms? What I do is, what I'm going to show you today in my 5 minutes that I have left is, I'm going to define exposure to the reform
either by sector or by occupation. It turns out that some sectors relied a lot on temporary contracts historically, while some other sectors not so much, and the same is true across occupations. So let me give you an example. For example, in the hospitality sector, in 2021, 35% of workers were on temporary contracts, so hospitality relied quite a lot on temporary contracts. Also construction, 42% of the jobs of the workers were on temporary contracts. So these sectors relied a lot on temporary contracts. On the other hand, sectors like manufacturing relied much less on temporary contracts, or in other words, most of their workers were on permanent contracts historically, or the financial sector, real estate. So really, across sectors, you find a lot of variation before the reform. And also the same is true for across occupations. So I'm going to define a sector's exposure to the reform as the fraction of the workforce on temporary contracts in the pre-reform period. And today I'm going to define this as the years 2017, 2018, and 2019. So the idea here is that the more the sector used to rely on temporary contracts, the more the sector would be hit by the new regulation. Think about the extreme case. If a firm is always hiring only with permanent contracts before, then the reform would leave them completely unaffected. And so, the evolution of their hiring and firing practices would be affected by other factors, but not by the reform. While a sector that only hired with temporary contracts, they would be fully exposed. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is a bit more technically, I'm going to run a difference in differences type of equation. You have the equation here, but essentially the sample includes all workers 5 years before the reform plus the reform year. And I'm going to look at different outcomes. And the way that this works is just basically I'm going to compare the change in employment in the more affected sectors with the change in employment in the less affected sectors. That's why it's called difference in differences, because I'm comparing the change in the treated group with the change in the control group. But here, treatment is, it's a gender. So you're more treated if your sector uses temporary contracts more pre-reform. We can run this equation like the static one or the dynamic or event study equation just to look at the dynamics, where we allow the interaction coefficient to vary over time, in this case by quarter. Okay, so let me show you just a few results. In terms of data, I'm going to show you 4 graphs using data from the Labor Force Survey, Spanish Labor Force Survey. This is a public data set, so you can go home and look at the data yourselves if you want. It's a quarterly survey of 65,000 households in Spain, and the advantage is that it contains rich information on labor market status of this representative sample of households. This includes contract type, sector, occupation, and so on. The drawback is that it includes no information on wages. So to look at effects on wages, we're going to have to wait a little longer for Social Security data. I pull all quarters between 2017 and 2022, so 5 years during reform. It'll be 1 year after the reform because that's what we have for. In terms of outcomes of interest, I'm going to show you first the effect on this sort of the first stage, which is the impact of the reform on the use of permanent contracts in the more affected sectors or occupations. Then I'm going to show you some effects on total employment. And of course, we're also interested in not just in the amount of jobs, but also the quality of jobs, so employment stability, turnout, tenure, earnings. I'm not going to show you those outcomes today, but this is something that we want to look at. Okay, so just again, 4 figures to conclude, to show you some initial results.
Here I'm illustrating the results from the dynamic specification, looking at the effect of the reform on the use of permanent contracts using this definition of treatment by sector. So what you can see here, and I'm showing the coefficients from 2019 to the end of 2022. Essentially what you can see in this graph, and I'm out of time, so I'm just going to take a couple more minutes. Okay. What you can see here is that before the reform, so in this is 2019, 2020, 2021, before the reform, my control and treatment sectors are evolving in parallel. The fact that here we have the coefficients, closely aligned around 0 is just showing that the use of permanent contracts was changing at the same pace between, in more affected and less affected sectors. And then what we see, so the yellow line here marks the reform, and thank you, Parijat, for making such a nice graph. So what we see is that after the reform, in these 4 quarters of 2022, the use of permanent contracts is increasing significantly more in sectors more exposed to the reform compared with sectors less exposed to the reform. And these are these are what I call effects of a reform, because now I am comparing a more affected group, a treatment group, with a control group. So we're arguably isolating the effects of a reform from other factors. And what's important here is to show that the control group is a good control group in this sense, meaning that it was evolving similarly to the treated group before the reform. This is when I use variation in the use of temporary contracts by sector. We can also do it by occupation. This is the same analysis for occupation, and again, the results are very similar in the sense that we see that occupations that relied more on temporary contracts before the reform increase the use of permanent contracts significantly more compared to the controls after the reform. Here we do see a little bit of a different evolution, but it's only in the 2nd and 3rd quarters of 2020. This is, of course, the COVID years, and we really don't want to use these 2 quarters as our main reference point. But other than that, we're doing fine in terms of parallel pre-trends. Okay, very last result. This is, as I said, kind of a first stage. So, okay, so firms were using more permanent contracts. But one thing that we're worried about is that, if you use permanent contracts, these contracts have higher firing
costs, so it's more expensive for firms to hire these workers in the event of firings. So the concern is that the reform may have affected total employment negatively. So firms will be hiring less now that they have to actually make decent contracts. Did this happen? So here I'm showing you the results for total employment by sector. So here I'm just counting, in each of these sectors, how many jobs would qualify. And here, what we see. I mean, it's more complicated. Here, what we see is that actually the treated and controlled sectors were
not evolving in parallel before the reform. So we see that actually there was kind of a negative trend, meaning that the affected sectors were creating more jobs in the years leading up to the reform compared to the control sectors in this case. So it's, the sort of the natural experiment here that I'm trying to estimate is not as convincing. But if we focus just on 2021, here in 2021, actually we don't have different trends. So if you want, the best that we can do here is to, to use sort of 2021 as the pre-period, and then compare it with 2022. And what we see is no real change in total employment in 2022 compared with 2021. With the caveat that there are pre-trends going on. And this is actually the same by occupation. So my difference in differences exercise is not so great when we're trying to look at outcomes beyond just the use of permanent contracts. But if you just want my take on this, there's little evidence of negative effect on employment on total employment in 2022, with the caveat that the identification strategy is not so great. Okay, so let me conclude. I'm out of time. So let me just say again, kind of the main takeaways from my talk.
My main takeaway is it's hard to separate the causal effect of the reform from other things going on during the same period, and the descriptive analysis of the time series is not enough. I think we can safely conclude, based on the evidence that I've shown you and the evidence that Miguel Angel will show you as well, we can safely say that the reform did increase the use of permanent contracts with hires in 2022. And this is supported by both the descriptive evidence and the regression analysis. And I've also shown you some suggestive evidence that so far there didn't seem to be negative effects on total employment. I think that it's going to be very important to keep looking, and in particular to also look at effects on job quality, including wages. This is what we're working on from now on. And it's also interesting to think more about the dynamics, because we only have 3 quarters after implementation as of today, and there could also be learning. For example, in the first quarters, the sanctions were very salient, and so firms really reacted by not using temporary contracts. But if these sanctions do not become effective, if there's learning, it may very well be a reversal. So we shouldn't really just take it for granted that the trend is going to continue on the same ways. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Libertad. I'm going to minimize the... And thank you, Miguel Angel. Now the floor is yours.
Pass me the mouse. The mouse. I prefer the mouse.
Oh, the mouse?
You prefer the mouse?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to share this table with you, and with you too, of course. Now, I want to talk about what is different in the, if any, in the labor market reform introduced in 2021. So now I have a bit different perspective in respect to Libertad, because I want to have a more historical perspective. Luis asked me.
And I like it. So here you have the case of Spain compared with other European countries.
In terms of the evolution of the share of temporary employees in respect to the total number of employees. It's a heat map, so what you see is toward red, higher percentages, and toward green, lower percentages. As you see, Spain is always among the countries with the highest share of temporary contracts. Only in recent years, and even in the last year, here you have the last quarters, is Netherlands going beyond Spain. Another country with a higher value, a higher figure for the share of temporary contracts is Poland. But as you see in the recent years, Poland had a decreasing trend thanks to, well, they say, thanks to a reform implemented in 2016 and the expectation of a new reform in a couple of years. But it's very clear when we see the experience of other countries in line with us in Europe that we have a differential problem related with temporary contracts. In fact, this is the evolution of this percentage for Spain since the first quarter. We have information about type of contract in the labor force survey, which was the second quarter in 1987. We see a period of
huge and fast increase in the temporary employment rate for all compared for females, in fact for males. And we were in 1987 around 15, and when we have this labor market reform in the 90s, in 1994, we were for all in 54%. Okay. In 1997, in the second reform of the 90s, we had more or less the same. The evolution was increasing for women, but more or less stable for men. And later, we have all these periods more or less with stability. Later, this huge decrease related with the correct position, with the exception of this decrease for women, which was mainly related with a small labor market reform, introducing the change about the conversion of temporary contracts into permanent contracts, especially for women. Here we have the reform implemented there was another reform in 2010, but well, the reform in 2010 was had a very short time span, have real effects. And even in my opinion, these small reforms so it's more or less from point of view of the same labor market reform with different intensity, the same topics. Later, we have a more or less stable with an increasing trend when the economy improves. You see that this difference is so wide by gender, they are not anymore in the constant position period. Here you have the current reform, this is the pandemic, 2020, with a decrease share of temporary contracts, later an increase, and the last reform had effects just here. As you can see, we have the decrease just some 2 quarters before the implementation of the labor market. So I will come back on this. The origin of this wide use of temporary contracts in Spain is related with what many people call the first labor market reform in Spain. In fact, it wasn't really the first, but well, we accept that. We accept this as the conventional wisdom. In 1984, what we had was a change in the regulation of a
very specific temporary contract, because temporary contracts existed before in Spain as in all European countries. So this reform consisted taking a contract created in 1984 and easing the use of that temporary contracts. What was really different with that temporary contract
was that the new regulation allowed to break the legal principle of causality in contract. The causality principle says that for temporary needs in the firm must use temporary contracts. For permanent needs in the firm must use open contracts, permanent contracts. Okay? So, with this contract created in 1982, because of the bad situation in the labor market, with unemployment rate reaching 20% and even more, they allow this type of contracting, not considering temporary needs of the firm to use the temporary contract. It was also allowed for permanent needs. But it was really difficult in 1982 to use this contract. There were a lot of vendors to be used. And in 1984, these restrictions were eliminated. And then we had what many authors call the honeymoon effect of temporary contracts. So, as in any honeymoon, the first years are really so what we see is not only an increase in the share of temporary contracts, this happened at the same time of an increase in total employment. Okay, so at the beginning, many people, many policymakers argued that all this was an effect of temporary contracts. But as Libertad has explained really well, a lot of things were happening at the same time. For example, an economic boom, and we were preparing the gains for the next year. Well, in fact, we were pushing the economy to a new state. Okay. In fact, we have some evidence collected by Samuel Ventolila showing that the temporary contracts had a positive effect on total employment, but rather small, significant, but rather small, because other things happen at the same time. So, what is very interesting also about temporary contracts, when they were allowed in this way in Spain, is that it was created as a flexibility of entry into the labor market. So, the policymakers thought that this was a way to push employment. Okay? But in fact, the firms used temporary contracts as flexibility for exit. So, when the firms have the option of a temporary contract, they will pay a lower amount of money when finishing the contract. And they can adapt to the ups and downs of the business cycle in a cheaper way and in a faster way. Right? So, we can see that the firing cost gap between temporary contracts and open-ended contracts is rather significant. Okay? The cost of ending a temporary contract is 12 wage days per seniority years, and this is well known by the firm. Just at the beginning of the contract, it's really difficult to go to the labor courts asking for more money. And for open-ended contracts, we have 20 wage days per seniority years in case of dismissal, and 33 before 45 in case of dismissal. Okay. Of course, many times the firms need open-ended contracts for many workers, especially for highly qualified jobs. Okay, a long-term relationship for some workers in the firm. But when the firm is worried about adapting to the ups and downs of the business cycle, having a buffer of temporary workers is very cheap. Okay. So the firm used the open-ended contracts as a way to protect the investment in human capital and in good valuable workers in the firm, and temporary contracts can be used as a buffer against the bad times. Okay, and even with temporary contracts, the firm can adapt to very short positive shocks because the firm knows that just when this short-term positive shock ends, the contract can be terminated in a miscue. Okay. So, a huge increase in the temporary contracts also had some negative impacts in the economy and in workers' life, which are well known by everybody. And in 1994, the policymakers tried to introduce a new regulation promoting open-ended contracts, trying to close this foreign cost gap. Okay. So they created, for example, the what we call the speed of objetivo. So a dismissal on economic grounds. Okay. Previously, it was very difficult to do a dismissal on economic grounds, not using the collective dismissal. Okay. It was possible, but really difficult. So in 1994, they created this new way, which can be understood as a decrease in the expected firing cost based on economic problems. In 1997, with an agreement between the main unions, employers' organizations, and the government, a new reform was implemented, creating new open-ended contracts with this severance payment for unfair dismissals. This is important because in Spain, at the end, usually workers are dismissed on unfair reasons, unfair grounds. Okay. Why? Well, I've written something about it. But the incentives for firms are working in the following way. We have a labor law based on the existence of a cost for dismissal. Okay. This is the cornerstone of the Spanish labor law and in other continental European countries. When a firm accepts that the dismissal is unfair, even existing economic grounds, the firm what gains is certainty about the cost of the dismissal. Okay, and it's an increase with respect to 80 wage days per seniority year, but the dismissal can be solved in a very fast way. In fact, even in 2 days or even 2 days. Okay. And because it's really difficult for the worker to obtain more going to the labor courts, to obtain more than 33 or 45 before labor courts. Okay. For the worker, there is a gain in terms of a higher severance pay. Okay. What they are losing is the protection of the labor, the effective protection of the labor law. Is inside Spanish case because they are accepting an unfair dismissal, so the cost for the dismissal is not important. So it's a sort of political economic liberty. Workers gain something, they lose something. The firms gain something, they lose also something. And this has remained in equilibrium until the 2012 reform. So all these reforms try to change this firing cost gap, moving things from the unfair dismissal towards the fair dismissal, but only the 2012 reform really changes things, promoting the use of the labor law and really using much more the 20 wage days per seniority. So after the 2012 reform, it was easier for judges to accept the dismissals on economic grounds. The definition of economic grounds, of dismissals of economic grounds was clearer than before, and really all these changed things. Okay. So at the end, the severance payments are the same, but the use is a bit different. The summary. All these reforms try to fight temporary contracts, trying to close the fighting cost gap, but partial. In fact, the proposal of the single contracts almost more than 15 years ago. 15 years ago. Try to close the fighting cost gap, not allowing temporary contracts at all, and changing all the system of the severance payments. So, but that was never implemented. But it was in this way, closing the fighting cost. The change in 2022 is different. So the rationale of the reform in 2022 is introducing huge restrictions for using temporary contracts. Right? So here you can see the changes, and I think this graph is more informative than the previous one, because here you can see different series for the private sector and the public sector. Because this was reform, the previous reforms too, in fact, affected to the private sector, not the public sector. The public sector had a very different regulation about the use of temporary contracts. Okay? And in fact, the most part of legal problems in the last 20 years have been related with the wide use of temporary contracts in the public sector, the wide and increasing use of temporary contracts. And you can see in the public sector, is for women, is for men. You see that since 1997 or less, or 2000, the increase in the temporary employment rate for women has been from around 20 to around 52, 54. So, very clear increase. Also for men, so. But in the private sector, what we have seen since the first reform of the 90s has been a trend towards a decrease in the use of temporary contracts. The different reforms, we have evidence about these reforms showing effects in this line, promoting the use of permanent contracts. Okay. But with effects that are rather small on these aggregate rates. So, at the individual level, we can see a positive impact on the probability of obtaining a new permanent contract. But when we try to find aggregate effects, these effects have been rather small. In fact, the most important event decreasing the temporary employment rate was for women, the reform of 2006, and the Great Recession. The Great Recession was an reform at all. So it was an economic disaster, okay, and maybe affecting, as you see, the private sector. Here you have the reform of 2012, and later you see that the evolution, the private sector of the temporary employment rate for males and females is more or less the same. Even we have some quarters with a higher temporary employment rate among men and not among women, which was the normal before. The normal is a higher temporary employment rate for women and not respect in the private sector. In the public sector too, but and finally, here you have the pandemic and the decrease, and later you have this evolution as in the first graph, showing that the decrease in the temporary employment rate began before the implementation of the reform. We know that in the previous year to the reform, there was more activity by the labor inspector trying to detect the wrong use of temporary contracts. And, well, we have some modes when we look at the administrative information, we can find the effect of very specific the very specific activities in these months of the labor inspectors, changing the contracts from temporary to permanent ones in SAMSA. This is the same flows from the register of contracts. Okay, so you see that the contract mostly used for the contract was the temporary ones, and there is a change with the labor market reform. This is the information, the same information, but segregated by type, red temporary contracts, open contracts. And you can see again that the most important break is just after the last reform. We have some breaks, especially here after the reform of 1997. Before, after, we see an increase. We can say it's too small, this is large. Well, this is always something to discuss. After the reform of 2012, what we see is an increase in the use of temporary contracts, but probably related with the changes. Finally, this is just ideas for the next future. Temp contracts were created as an entry flexibility, but they were used as an exit flexibility. So, what happened in exits? Well, this is descriptive information about the total gross flow of new entries into unemployment benefits, okay? Using the data from the Spanish Public Employment Services. In pink, you can see the end of temporary contracts. These are the 2 years of the pandemic, and here you have 2022. In red, you have dismissals. These are also dismissals, collective dismissals. And in gray, what we can call the temporary layoffs. Temporary layoffs are ERTEs. Okay. So, widely used in the years of the pandemic, and after the reform, more widely used than before the pandemic. We don't know if here we have mostly firms affected by the pandemic crisis, or a wider use of this mean of adjustment. Okay. I think this is mostly related with a new pattern of adjustment. This is only my hypothesis. Okay. So, what we can see when we compare 2022 with the years previous to the pandemic is that the use of temporary contracts as an exit flexibility is not so wide as before, but it is the main reason for a new entry into the unemployment benefit system. And what about the intermittent permanent contracts, the fijos discontinuos? They are improved. Okay. So, we see more entries because of an intermittent permanent contract. But, well, they are not replacing the most part of the contracts, only partially. This is the double than before. But, well, they were before around 8%, a bit more, and now we have here this would be more or less 90%. Okay, a bit more than the double. So, when we compare the use of temporary permanent contracts, well, it's much more important now. But they are not replacing all or the vast majority of temporary contracts. And the use of individual dismissals is more or less the same. So, more or less, there is a new pattern of adjustment consisting of partially the intermittent permanent contracts replace a bit temporary contracts. And we have more temporary jobs than before. But individual dismissals have the same relative importance as before. In fact, everything related with the cost of dismissals is the same. So there is a rationale for not finding any change here and finding some change in the distribution of the other reasons related with the changes introduced by the reform. We have had a short experience with the reform, only 1 year, and not for the whole year, because it was a transitory period until April, so we need more time. Okay, but probably, from my own point of view, things have been very different, but as other reforms, maybe we are at the end of the effects in terms of the impact of increasing the temporary contracts. Well, maybe. So, thank you very much. Sorry for that.
Thank you to you, Miguel Angel. Now there is the possibility for you, for the audience, to ask questions, make comments, wherever. Is there anyone who wants to say anything? Yeah. Hold on.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's fascinating time to be talking about that. And especially thank you, Miguel Angel, for the last graph, because that was the topic I came here to ask about. I know it's about future, so it's kind of, but your impressions of what is going to happen, where are labor practices going? Because one of that would be about the public sector. Will we see also a decrease in the public sector, which is heavily dependent in healthcare and education, on, especially among women, on a chain, no? One after other temporary contract? And the other would be about these roundabout ways how contractors can make supposedly indefinite contracts and then still let people go. One of that would be the trial period, no? And we saw in your last graph the increase of people being let go during the trial periods. And the other would be about the practice of basically both parties knowing that the indefinite contract is actually not one, and that the dismissal costs are just calculated in the HR costs of that. This will actually last 3 years, and then we will pay you for whatever you're owed by law. So I would like to hear about your impressions of where is this going. Thank you.
What about the public sector? I think that the public sector will be affected by a different part, not this reform, but they had agreement, the government and unions had agreements to change the pattern for hiring temporary workers in the public administration. There was an agreement, I remember, before the summer in 2021, and another one at the end of the year, I think. They should be implemented now. So the human resources practices in the public sector should be changing as fast as in the private sector just now. And we don't see that, at least at an aggregate level. So I think that this will be harder than they expected. And I think that this is because we have different public administrations working here. So if I'm not wrong, the temporary employment rate was higher in municipalities and in other public administrations, more than in the central administration or the regional autonomic administration. So the incentives, are different in the public sector. When a firm is wrong about hiring the right people, profits will decrease, and finally the firm will be bankrupt. But what happens when someone in the public sector make the wrong choices about the type of contracts? Well, we as citizens will pay, but not human resource manager. So the incentives to adopt a new way to hire workers are different in the public sector. And I think that your agreements are not really in line with that. Probably these agreements will need another round in the next year or the next months. And I think there was another part of the comment about the type of contracts and the duration of contracts. So, well, we are changing the use of the type of contracts, but at the end, it's also very important about the duration of contracts. I remember that we were very worried at the end of the 80s because of the wide use of temporary contracts. And then the minimum length for a temporary contract was 1 year. So this is a stability from our point of view. And the maximum duration of a temporary contract was 3 years. I remember I had a friend very worried because his contract was only for 3 years. So now in the research sector, for example, you say, you have a contract for 3 years. Wow, these people would be very happy. So the perspective about what the stability is are really different now. And some of the reforms we implemented in the 90s, trying to decrease the use of temporary contracts, they created more precarious temporary contracts because we moved from that type of contract to other temporary contracts more precarious in terms of lower duration, but also a lower cost for termination of the contracts. For some periods, the cost was 0. For some, not all, but for some temporary contracts. And coming back to the public sector, the interim contract has a cost for termination of 0. This is not true for private firms. The private firm must pay at the end of the temporary contract. So, well, the public sector needs to adapt.
So Luis, let me say a few words too. So yeah, because your second question I thought was, of course, very relevant, you know, like it's only been 3 quarters, less than 1 year. What's going to happen, and is it really going to affect, you know, like the labor market outcomes that we care about and not just the name of the contract? I think that's very relevant. And I think the answer is we don't know yet. I mean, we have only seen the very short-term effects. And I mean, first of all, the increasing in firing costs is real. So it's not just the renaming. If you hire someone with an open-ended contract, the cost of hiring this worker has increased, whether you incorporate it, you internalize it from the beginning or not. It's just more expensive for the same, you know, net wage. It's more expensive for the firm. So you know, this will potentially affect firms' behaviors. And the sanction, if you use a temporary contract sort of incorrectly, in principle is real. Now, of course, the question is, will these sanctions really be applied? And in previous reforms, firms somehow always found a way around the reform. And I think we still don't know if the firms will find ways around this. So far, they mostly complied. But, you know, you suggested the use of other types of contracts, like, I don't know, some kind of like training contracts or so. Yeah. Yeah, so far they haven't found ways around it in terms of just purely the use of permanent contracts. We haven't seen the effects on total employment yet, and we don't know if these sanctions are really going to be used or not. So I think it's and they're, you know, like the making the use of intermittent contracts easier was part of the reform. So this was intended. Now it's not entirely clear in the phrasing of the reform what exactly counts as a, you know, like a discontinuous permanent contract. So I think there is still a lot of room for firms to learn how they can sort of game a little bit the system, and for courts to decide, because so far we have very little sort of experience in court from how these things are resolved. So yeah, I'm also curious.
Well, is it on? Yeah. Thanks for the talk. I think as a person that is about to enter the labor market in some years, this gives maybe a bit of hope. Let's see. So my question is more related about whether you've studied the potential effect of this reform across different cohorts of workers, no? And I think about this because of two reasons. First of all, the graphs you both were showing were about entries into the labor market. So I think an old worker entering into the labor market is probably really different, no, from a young worker that does so. So there could be also compositional changes if you look at these two different type of workers. And then I'm also thinking about the implications, no, that maybe the potential qualitative improvement if once you look at what are the effects in, for instance, job stability may have across these different two types of workers. And I think, for instance, also for young workers, no, like if one of the consequences of this reform is that my labor market is more stable in a sense, this probably may have interesting consequence as well in fertility, for instance, which is also another way maybe of selling this reform, no, to policymakers. Thank you.
Can I go first? Yes, I think part of your story is about age. You said cohorts. Yeah, so my differences exercise that I was showing here was by sector and occupation, but actually we've also looked by age. And in fact, I mean, the effects that we see on the use of permanent contracts, they bite much more for young workers. So, you know, most older workers have managed to access open-ended contracts, you know, by their 40s. So if you look at the very young workers, that's where you see a huge increase. You know, the graph looks even steeper than this one for young versus old workers. So I do think that's another way to think about it. You know, another potential control group would be older workers, and the younger ones are where you're going to see the action. So I'm very much interested with what's going to happen for younger workers, not just in terms of the type of contract, but of course, you know, the actual outcomes in terms of unemployment rates, job stability and earnings, and side effects, as you said, fertility and so on. But we still need to wait a little bit for this. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. I think it's very interesting learning all about the trends and a little bit more about the employment labor market, because we study this at the moment, so it's giving a lot of background information for us. So the question I had is, in one of your graphs, it spoke about how, although in the reform, the temporary contracts are decreasing, but then we've got the open contracts are increasing quite a bit. Do you see open contracts as a worse issue than the temporary contracts, and do you think you can see a reform tackling this issue?
I think it's about your figure. So sorry, can you clarify what the figure that you were referring to? Why were you see the drop in temporary and the increase in open-ended?
I think it was one of the last ones in Malo's, the blue one there, down, number 7, I believe.
No, the next one.
Oh no, yeah, do you see how the open-ended contracts are rising quite a bit since the reform, but then the temporary contracts are going down? Do you see this might be an issue that we see in the reform? While we're seeing the temporary contracts go down, we now have a new issue of open contracts rising.
Open-ended is the same as permanent in the sense that there's no...
Open-ended is permanent. Okay. So what we have here is the raw data. So this is probably also related with some monthly effects. So, okay. But if you look at the trend, there is a very clear trend towards an increase. So I think that the main point is if temporary contracts are decreasing at the same time, this one is increasing. Why? Because a permanent contract these are flows, but a new permanent contract will be in the stock more time than a lot of different temporary contracts. So if these new permanent contracts are really stable, we'll see a huge decrease in the use of new temporary contracts, okay? This is the idea related with stability. But going beyond that, if we go towards a labor market with more stable employment relationships, this will be a labor market with people more stable in employment, but also more stable in unemployment. Because the amount of flows from unemployment into employment will be not so much as before. So this is a good thing of temporary contracts. They increase the number of transitions from unemployment to employment. The problem is that we see an increase also in the other flow, okay? But if we go to a labor market with more stable employment relationship, we will have unemployed persons more stable in unemployment. So an increase in the percentage of long-term unemployment. At the end, if the cycle is exactly the same in the crisis and in the boom times, and the length of both parts of the business cycle is exactly the same, so at the end, the average employment is exactly the same, with higher or lower firing cost. And this is a change in firing cost, affecting mainly temporary contracts. But the distribution of flows will be different.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Thanks for the talk. So I wanted to ask about, there's been a clear change in the way that they are implementing reform, right? They were tackling non-labor costs, like firing cost and other stuff. And here, basically, they have prohibited, or kind of restricted a lot, the use of temporary contracts. And I think that what we see, is a huge effect on, the use of temporary contracts per se, the first stage. And this basically has, I think that with the point that Libertad was mentioning, that it was clearly now firms do not know how to get around, right? It talks about also with the point that you mentioned that in 2019, when they started sending letters about the conversion, we're gonna audit you about the use of temporary contracts. If you draw the timeline with data conversion, you see that the conversions spiked on the month that they were sending the letters. So I think that it's very interesting to see the point that in the market in Spain, maybe lots of firms are surviving precisely because they can get around the law, right? In a sense, they are we have seen now other evidence from other countries in which they apply a law in which it increases I don't know, the standard for the firm to be productive, I don't know, higher minimum wages and so on. This has translated into higher productivity firms, or workers moving to higher productivity. So today we've talked a lot about the perspective from the worker, right? But how about the perspective of the economy, in which now firms need to comply with a law that increases the standards of the labor that they need to demand, right? So what's your take on this side?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, of course, this reform, so Miguel Ángel talked about the 1984 reform, where the use of temporary contracts was made easier. And the point there was precisely to promote job creation, right? So the idea was that, okay, we're making it easier to hire and fire, and then this is going to benefit firms and workers. But then, what we saw since then was that temporary contracts, okay, so there was a small effect on job creation, but also there was this, inefficiency created by this gap in firing costs, which has been, very problematic. And I do believe that, that the system has created a lot of inefficiencies in the sense of firms destroying jobs unnecessarily just to not make workers permanent because that would make them more expensive, and then just wasting huge amounts of, firm-specific training and human capital, and then having workers in and out of unemployment. So, I do think that there were huge inefficiencies. Now, of course, the question is whether those inefficiencies are going to be solved now with the new reform or not. But yeah, so one very plausible effect of this reform is going to be some, less job creation and perhaps some firm exit for the firms that were really, at the margin of only being able to hire because of these cheap short-term contracts. So I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And then we don't really, I don't think we really know the answer. My expectation would be, just like we saw small increase in employment, small effects on employment of the 1994 reform, perhaps I would expect small negative effects on unemployment of the new reform. But, perhaps some firms should not exist, if they're just not profitable, if they have to pay a decent wage or make a decent contract, then perhaps they shouldn't exist. So we'll see.
Well, I don't know, but I'm in line with Libertad. About the impact on productivity of the temporary contracts, I think that the key issue is that the relationship between the wide use of temporary contracts and productivity is not the same in all sectors. It's critical in high-skilled sectors. When you need in your firms using workers with a high level of skills, temporary contracts can be very damaging to productivity in these sectors. So probably restricting the use of temporary contracts will be very good for these sectors. About the survival of firms using a lot of temporary contracts in low productivity industries, well, I'm not really sure because, well, for example, many activities will have the intermittent permanent contracts, or they can use other ways of adapting to the business cycle. I'm not really sure, but I think that the main point is maybe what will happen in these sectors requiring high skill, a high level of skills of workers, and even channeling temporary contracts via the temporary work agencies is better for productivity, probably because of the selection in hiring provided by these firms. What we see, yes, the international evidence show that temporary work agencies, the temporary workers from temporary work agencies are always on average, in high-skilled sectors, more in the low-skilled sectors. Right?
I've got some questions myself for each one of you. I think it's been really interesting evidence. For you, Miguel Angel, I've got a couple of questions. One of them is regarding gender. There was an obvious gender inequality. I mean, the probability of having a temporary job at the beginning of the period that you have analyzed, the probability was much higher for women than for men, and this seems to have been reverted in a way. So what would be the reasons of that? Because I think this is interesting from a point of view of inequality. There's been a gender inequality that in some sense have been corrected. That would be my first question. My second question is related to some of the labor market reforms that were aimed at correcting this excessive temporary employment and did not succeed at all, like 2012, or at least it seemed that the rate of temporary employment increased. So could you tell us more about why a labor market reform like 2012 was so ineffective in that? I mean, what things came in its way in order to disrupting? It could have been that it was not the reform itself, but something that happened at the same time. So that would be my questions for you. And for Libertad, I think I have found extremely interesting the graphs that you have presented with effect on temporary employment and with effect on total employment, especially the ones on total employment, this diff in diff exercise. Could you show us the graph with the effect on total employment? Because I have, when I was looking at the graph, I was having the feeling that it looked as if, the one on total employment, it looks as if there was a trend already going on before the labor market reform for a convergence between the treatment and the control group, in the sense that total employment was kind of converging between these. So there was something going on there before the reform. And actually, if there is any effect of the reform, had been to stop that trend. To stop that trend. I mean, there was, no? So could it be that, I mean, possibly we were expecting all the other things. We were expecting that the treatment group had a loss in loss in employment relative to the control. This is an unexpected result, but I think it's kind of passing and interesting, because it's not that nothing happened. It looks like what happened is something that was unexpected. There was a convergence going on between the treatment and the control group, and the reform. And the reform stopped that, no? I mean, so these were my questions to.
So maybe mine is faster. I'll go. So yeah, I don't know. That's one possible interpretation of this graph. For me, the interpretation is more like we can't conclude much about the causal effect on total employment from this evidence, just because, for the exercise to be valid, we want, what we're trying to do is to kind of predict what would have happened in the affected sectors in the absence of the reform, and my control sectors here are not providing a good counterfactual for what would have happened, because they were already evolving differently. So, I don't know.
It's very weird. I mean, it's a weird.
Yeah, so I'll have to think more about how to credibly estimate effects on total employment by sector, because I really don't know what to make of this.
Right.
But yeah, it's true that I would have expected, like negative coefficients, but the trend was already going on in advance. So if I had seen negative coefficients, I wouldn't have been able to conclude that there was a causal effect, because it was already going on before. But I don't see the negative coefficients, so yes, it's a zero effect, but with pre-trend. So maybe I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Libertad.
I begin with the last question. Why no effects, or so small effects, in the labor market reform implemented in 2012? I would say that there is no such a thing as a small labor market reform, but also there is no such a thing as a big labor market reform. It's a different thing, changing many parts of the labor law, many parts of labor regulation, and this is different respect to obtaining the impact you expect in different variables. So I think, for example, we have evidence from, for example, Nacho Garcia, showing that the labor market reform implemented in 2012 created permanent employment. The effect was positive, although rather small, but it was positive, okay? But I would say that this was the same of the findings by Ventolila about all this time period about the use of temporary contracts. The temporary contracts increased employment, but that increase was small. So many times changing different parts of the labor law affects to so many different incentives that at the end it's really difficult to find a net effect on the variable. I think that we are really obsessed when we reform the labor market about changing many things. Well, this was created not introducing a new contract, but just changing something about one temporary contract. And the effect has been lasting, well, until now, and probably even a bit more. So changing the labor law can be really dangerous. in this, because we don't understand very well the incentives we are creating or the incentives we are leaving aside, and they won't exist anymore. And then the firms adapt to these changes. Now we have firms knowing very well how to use the temporary contract for the ups and downs of the business cycle. And believe me, they are artists using all the possibilities of the labor law just now that they have been using so much the temporary contracts. In 1997, there were incentives to use the permanent intermittent contracts too, a lot of them. And we only saw an increase in the use of this contract in Murcia, in the agricultural sector, and in the Balearic Islands in the tourism sector. The rest of the country was almost unaffected. And the temporary jobs has been traditionally widely used in the cars industry, but almost no use in any other part of the economy until just now, in the pandemic crisis, and a lot of firms now follow it, a crash course about how to manage this adjustment to bad times. And now they are using more this possibility created by the labor law in the middle of the Great Recession. The current regulation is more or less the regulation created in the Great Recession. But in the Great Recession, the temporary layoff was not useful because the way to adapt to that crisis was reallocation, not simply suspending the labor contracts waiting for the good times. And about the gender differences, I think that all these gaps, this huge, absolutely amazing gap.
Well, the truth is that it has been corrected in the private sector, but in the public
Yes.
one,
In
it's not so much. No?
These are the incentives of the human resources managers in the two worlds, in the private world and in the public world. So here we have the wider use of temporary contracts in the educational sector and in the health sector. The use of the temporary contracts in the public sector was also, well, very frequent in the 80s. But the use so wide as now in the health sector is something created in the mid-90s, more or less.
So you learn how to use all this contract even for hours. So the adaptation of the other sector to the use of one kind of temporary contract has been, I would say, perfect.
Of these contracts. Yeah. And well, the difference between men and women is so clear. For example, in the tourism sector, touristic activities have a higher temporary employment rate. But in fact, for men, the temporary employment rate in touristic activities is the average of the whole economy. The difference is for women. So temporary contracts in the tourism sector is saying women. No men. The men are in jobs where a permanent employment relationship is needed. Jobs with higher human capital, with the stable activity of the touristic firm, and so on. And women are in the jobs very affected by seasonality in tourism.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. I finished the roundtable appreciating quite a lot and saying thank you to our colleagues who have spent with us this time and made this effort. I think it's very informative, so I really, really appreciate it and I have learned a lot. Thank you very much.